The Pillow Killer, the Yvan Keller story. In the peaceful Alsace region of eastern France, where traditional half-timbered houses dot the countryside and elderly residents live quiet lives in close-knit communities, a landscape gardener built a reputation for excellent work and friendly service. Yvan Keller was known to his neighbors as helpful and kind, a man who loved animals and took pride in his small business. But behind this carefully cultivated facade lived one of France's most prolific serial killers. Between 1989 and 2006, Keller would murder at least 23 people and claim responsibility for 150 deaths, targeting elderly victims with a weapon as simple as it was intimate: a pillow. This is the story of the Pillow Killer, whose final words, "I just wanted to be loved," revealed the twisted psychology behind one of the most shocking crime sprees in French criminal history. The 1990s in France's Alsace region represented a time of quiet prosperity and social stability. Located on the border with Germany and Switzerland, Alsace had a unique cultural identity shaped by centuries of changing national allegiances. The region's elderly population often lived independently in traditional homes, maintaining the self-reliant lifestyle that had characterized the area for generations. In small communities throughout Haute-Rhône and Basse-Rhône, elderly residents frequently lived alone, relying on local tradespeople and service providers for home maintenance and care. This system of trust and interdependence had worked for decades, creating bonds between generations and ensuring that even the most vulnerable residents could maintain their independence and dignity. It was into this environment of trust and tradition that Yvan Keller would insert himself, exploiting the very social bonds that had protected these communities for generations. His crimes would shatter the sense of security that allowed elderly people to live peacefully in their own homes, forever changing how such communities viewed strangers and service providers. Yvan Keller was born on December 13, 1960 in Wittenheim, a small commune in the Haute-Rhône department of Alsace. He was one of 9 children born to parents who worked as basket makers and were described as sedentary travelers, people who had adopted a settled lifestyle while maintaining some of the cultural traditions of France's traveling communities. The Keller family lived on Rue du Bourg, where they struggled to make ends meet despite having multiple sources of income. Yvan's father, Joseph, worked in Alsace's potash mines when he wasn't making baskets, representing the kind of hard physical labor that characterized working-class life in the region. The family's economic situation was precarious, requiring everyone to contribute to their survival. Yvan grew up in what sources describe as a rather unstable family, where his father's demands for hard work created a stressful household environment. The pressure to contribute financially from an early age may have contributed to Yvan's later obsession with money and luxury. The early death of his mother at age 49 represented another traumatic loss that would shape his psychological development. The combination of economic pressure and family instability led Yvan into criminal behavior at a remarkably young age. At just 17 in 1981, he was arrested for stealing 2 antiques in the nearby town of Battenheim. This crime, which might have been dismissed as youthful indiscretion, instead resulted in a shocking sentence that would change the trajectory of his life. Yvan was sentenced to 10 years in prison for robbery, an unusually harsh punishment for what appeared to be a relatively minor theft committed by a teenager. This lengthy incarceration during his formative years, from age 17 to 27, meant that Yvan would spend his entire young adulthood behind bars, missing crucial developmental experiences and socialization opportunities. The decade-long imprisonment also meant that when Yvan was finally released in August 1989, he emerged into a world that had changed significantly during his incarceration. At 29 years old, he had the criminal record of a repeat offender, but the social skills and life experience of someone much younger, creating a dangerous combination of criminal knowledge and emotional immaturity. Upon his release in August 1989, Yvan initially appeared to be making a genuine effort to build a legitimate life. He moved to Mulhouse, settling on Rue de Verdun in an apartment within an old mansion located in a quiet, green area away from the city center. This choice of residence suggested someone seeking respectability and distance from his criminal past. Yvan established himself as a landscape gardener, creating a small company called Alsace Jardin. His clients were consistently satisfied with his work and frequently recommended him to others, indicating that he possessed genuine skills and could deliver quality service when he chose to do so. This legitimate business success showed that Yvan was capable of earning an honest living if he had committed to that path. During this period, Yvan lived what appeared to be a modest, conventional life. He had a romantic relationship with a woman named Marina, and neighbors described him as helpful, friendly, and particularly affectionate with animals. This public persona of the caring, reliable tradesman would provide perfect cover for the violent crimes he was planning. Despite his outward appearance of reform and respectability, Yvan's underlying character flaws soon began to manifest in disturbing ways. According to Marina, his first companion, Yvan had an insatiable appetite for luxury that went far beyond what his modest landscaping business could support. He craved expensive restaurants, high-end hotels, casino gambling, and horse racing, a lifestyle that required far more money than he was earning legitimately. Marina later revealed that Yvan had forced her into prostitution to fund his expensive tastes, demonstrating a willingness to exploit and degrade those closest to him for financial gain. This revelation showed that beneath his friendly exterior lay someone capable of treating other human beings as mere sources of income, a mindset that would prove crucial to understanding his later crimes. When Yvan's relationship with Marina ended, he found a new companion named Séverine. However, this relationship was also marked by violence and control. When Yvan discovered that Séverine was involved with another man, ironically a childhood friend of his, he confronted the man with a gun, placing it in his mouth and threatening him to stay away from his woman. This incident revealed both Yvan's violent potential and his deep need to control those around him. By January 1994, Yvan had begun what would become a systematic campaign of murder targeting elderly residents throughout the Alsace region. His first confirmed victim was Marie Winterholer, who was found dead in her bed in Bernhaupt-le-Haut on Rue Basse. The local doctor concluded it was a natural death and issued a burial permit exactly as Yvan had planned. On March 12, 1994, Germain went to visit his 86-year-old mother, Ernestine Mang, at 11 Rue Basse. Upon entering the house, he was surprised to find an old butter churn positioned just behind the door, an item that had been stored in the cellar for years, and which his mother, who had difficulty moving due to hip problems, could never have moved herself. Germain found his mother dead in bed, lying on her back with the bedding drawn to perfection. This detail immediately struck him as suspicious, since Ernestine's mobility issues meant she could never have made the bed so neatly herself. These small but telling details would later become crucial evidence in understanding Yvan's methodology. On April 27, 1994, 77-year-old Augusta Wasmer was found dead in her bed at 22 Rue Basse, lying on her back in the same position as the previous victims. Her daughter, Marie-Françoise Roquelin, immediately noticed that the bed was too perfectly made for someone in her mother's condition to have accomplished. No signs of break-in were observed, suggesting the killer had gained entry through trust or deception. The autopsy concluded that Augusta had died of cardiac arrest, probably due to great fear, a finding that suggested she had been conscious and terrified during her final moments. Later, investigation revealed that Augusta's bank card and a house key had disappeared, and the card had been used to make 3 withdrawals in Mulhouse, providing the first concrete evidence that these deaths were connected to theft. The pattern was becoming clear. Elderly victims found dead in their beds, positioned on their backs with perfectly made bedding, no signs of forced entry, and missing valuables that were later traced to transactions in Mulhouse. The killer was someone who could gain the trust of elderly residents, had access to their homes, and possessed the technical knowledge to make the murders appear natural. Yvan's profession as a landscape gardener provided him with the perfect cover for his crimes. As he traveled throughout the Alsace region maintaining gardens and providing landscaping services, he could easily observe potential victims and assess their vulnerability. Elderly homeowners living alone were particularly attractive targets, as they often had accumulated wealth but limited ability to defend themselves. His methodology was both simple and effective. Yvan would suffocate his victims in their beds using pillows or other soft materials, ensuring that the death appeared natural and left no obvious signs of violence. After killing his victims, he would carefully remake their beds to perfection, creating the illusion that they had died peacefully in their sleep. The financial motive was always present. Yvan stole money, paintings, jewelry, and other valuables from his victims, which he would later sell to junk dealers. His expensive lifestyle of gambling, fine dining, and luxury hotels required a constant stream of income that his legitimate landscaping business simply couldn't provide. Each murder was essentially a carefully planned robbery that eliminated the only witness. After his eventual arrest, Yvan would claim responsibility for an astonishing 150 murders, a number that, if accurate, would make him the most prolific French serial killer of the 20th century. However, investigators were only able to definitively link him to 23 murders, though they suspected him of as many as 40 deaths across France, Switzerland, and Germany. The geographic scope of Yvan's crimes was remarkable, spanning multiple countries and demonstrating a level of mobility and planning that suggested careful coordination. His landscaping business provided the perfect excuse for travel, allowing him to work in different regions while scouting for potential victims and establishing the trust necessary to gain access to their homes. Between 1993 and 2003, Yvan was denounced to authorities 3 different times by people who suspected his involvement in suspicious deaths. However, the first 2 reports were not properly investigated, allowing him to continue killing for years. Only the 3rd denunciation after 3 years of investigation finally led to his arrest. The investigation that would ultimately expose Yvan's crimes began when family members of victims started noticing disturbing patterns in the deaths of their elderly relatives. The perfectly made beds, the suspicious positioning of objects, and the missing valuables all pointed to something more sinister than natural death. Investigators found similarities across multiple cases that suggested a single perpetrator was responsible. The methodology was too consistent to be coincidental. Elderly victims found in bed, apparent natural deaths that upon closer examination revealed signs of suffocation, and missing items that could be traced to sales in local markets. Yvan's landscaping business brought him into contact with many of the victims, providing both opportunity and access. His reputation for quality work and friendly demeanor had made him a trusted figure in communities throughout Alsace, giving him the perfect cover for assessing potential targets and planning his attacks. When Yvan was finally arrested in 2006, investigators expected to charge him with a handful of murders based on the evidence they had gathered. However, they were completely unprepared for what happened next. Rather than denying the charges or minimizing his involvement, Yvan immediately confessed and claimed responsibility for far more crimes than investigators had imagined. Yvan's confession included the stunning claim that he had killed approximately 150 people during his criminal career. This number was so large that investigators initially dismissed it as fantasy or attention-seeking behavior. However, as they examined unsolved deaths in areas where Yvan had worked, they began to find patterns that suggested his claims might not be entirely fabricated. The confession revealed the systematic nature of Yvan's crimes and his willingness to travel great distances to find suitable victims. He admitted to being active not only in France but also in Switzerland and Germany, taking advantage of the relatively open borders in the European Union to expand his hunting ground across multiple countries. Despite Yvan's sweeping confessions, prosecutors could only bring formal charges for 5 murders, 3 in Haute-Rhin in 1994 and 2 in Bas-Rhin. 8 additional murders were under investigation, with investigators finding similarities to other cases that suggested Yvan's involvement, but the evidence was insufficient for formal charges. The legal proceedings were complicated by the sheer scope of Yvan's claimed crimes and the difficulty of proving murders that had been specifically designed to appear natural. Many of the victims had been buried before anyone suspected foul play, making forensic examination impossible. In some cases, the only evidence was the pattern of suspicious circumstances surrounding the deaths. As the case proceeded through the courts, Yvan appeared to be cooperating with investigators, providing details about his methods and locations where he had committed crimes. However, the verification of his confessions proved challenging, as many of the deaths he claimed responsibility for had occurred years earlier and in different jurisdictions. On September 22, 2006, as legal proceedings continued at the Mulhouse High Court, Yvan Keller made a final, desperate decision that would ensure his story would never be fully told. In his courthouse holding cell, he fashioned a noose from his shoelaces, intertwining them to create a makeshift rope that he looped through a light fixture. Yvan's suicide robbed both the justice system and the families of his victims of the closure that a full trial might have provided. His death meant that many of his confessions would never be properly investigated, and the true scope of his crimes would remain forever unknown. The families of suspected victims would never know with certainty whether their loved ones had died naturally or been murdered. According to witnesses, Yvan's last words were, "I just wanted to be loved," a statement that revealed the twisted psychology behind his crimes. These final words suggested that his murders may have been motivated not just by greed, but by a deeper psychological need for control and attention that he had never learned to satisfy through healthy relationships. Yvan's final words provide crucial insight into the psychology behind his crimes. His statement, "I just wanted to be loved," suggests that his murders may have been motivated by more than simple greed. The act of entering victims' homes, gaining their trust, and then killing them in their most vulnerable state may have represented a twisted form of intimacy for someone incapable of forming genuine human connections. The choice of elderly victims may have been significant beyond their vulnerability and wealth. Elderly people often represent wisdom, experience, and the kind of stable family relationships that Yvan had never experienced in his own chaotic childhood. By killing them in their beds and carefully arranging their bodies, he may have been enacting a fantasy of control over the love and security he felt he had been denied. Yvan's expensive lifestyle and constant need for money may have provided the practical motivation for his crimes, but the methodical way he carried them out suggests deeper psychological needs. The pillow method of murder was intimate and personal, requiring him to be close to his victims during their final moments, a level of involvement that purely financial motivation would not explain. The revelation of Yvan's crimes devastated the close-knit communities of Alsace, where trust between neighbors and service providers had been the foundation of social life for generations. Elderly residents who had once felt safe in their own homes now lived in fear, suspicious of the very people who had previously helped them maintain their independence. The case forced families throughout the region to re-examine the deaths of elderly relatives, wondering whether what they had accepted as natural deaths might actually have been murders. This uncertainty was particularly painful for families who had buried their loved ones without the proper investigation that might have revealed the truth. Local service providers, gardeners, repairmen, and other tradespeople found their businesses affected as elderly customers became reluctant to allow strangers into their homes. The bonds of trust that had sustained these communities for decades had been shattered by one man's exploitation of that very trust. Even after Yvan's death, investigators continued trying to verify his confessions and identify additional victims. The challenge was enormous, examining potentially 150 deaths across multiple countries, many of which had occurred years earlier and had been classified as natural deaths. Some cases had insufficient records, while others involved victims who had been cremated before anyone suspected murder. In some instances, investigators were able to find patterns that supported Yvan's claims. Deaths of elderly people in areas where he had worked, often involving victims found in perfectly made beds with missing valuables, began to form a picture of systematic killing that spanned decades and crossed multiple borders. However, the verification process also revealed the limitations of Yvan's confessions. Some of the deaths he claimed responsibility for could not have been committed by him due to verifiable alibis, suggesting that his claimed victim count of 150 may have been inflated by false confessions, fantasy, or a desire for notoriety. The Yvan Keller case exposed significant weaknesses in how authorities investigated suspicious deaths, particularly those involving elderly victims. The fact that he was denounced 3 times before being arrested highlighted the need for better coordination between different police jurisdictions and more systematic investigation of patterns in suspicious deaths. The case also demonstrated the importance of forensic examination, even in cases where death appears natural. Many of Yvan's victims might have been identified sooner if standard protocols had required more thorough investigation of deaths involving valuable missing items or other suspicious circumstances. Following the case, French authorities implemented new procedures for investigating deaths of elderly people living alone, particularly when valuable items are missing or when family members report suspicions about the circumstances. These reforms were designed to prevent future predators from exploiting the same systemic weaknesses that had allowed Yvan to operate for so long. Yvan Keller's suicide left many crucial questions unanswered about the true scope of his crimes and his motivations. His claim of 150 victims remains unverified, leaving investigators and families in limbo about whether their loved ones were among his victims. The geographic scope of his crimes across 3 countries also means that some of his victims may never be identified. The timing of his criminal career also raises questions about when he actually began killing. While his confirmed crimes dated to 1994, some investigators believe he may have started much earlier, possibly soon after his release from prison in 1989. The gap between his release and his first confirmed murder may simply reflect the success of his methods in making deaths appear natural. Perhaps most troubling is the question of whether Yvan had accomplices or whether other killers learned from his methods. Some of the deaths he claimed responsibility for may have been committed by copycats who adopted his techniques, raising the possibility that his influence extended beyond his own direct crimes. The Yvan Keller case became one of France's most notorious criminal cases, inspiring extensive media coverage and multiple television documentaries. The combination of his large victim count, his seemingly normal exterior, and his dramatic suicide created a story that fascinated the French public and international observers. Television programs on networks including NT1, W9, and NRJ12 examined different aspects of the case, while radio shows on RTL featured detailed analysis of Yvan's crimes and psychology. The media attention helped keep the case in the public consciousness and encouraged other potential victims' families to come forward with information. The case also influenced popular culture representations of serial killers, particularly the archetype of the helpful neighbor or service provider who exploits trust to commit murder. Yvan's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing strangers into one's home, regardless of how respectable they might appear. The Yvan Keller case provided valuable lessons for law enforcement agencies about the investigation of serial crimes, particularly those targeting elderly victims. The case demonstrated the importance of looking beyond individual jurisdictions when patterns of suspicious deaths emerge, as serial killers often operate across multiple territories to avoid detection. The case also highlighted the need for better training in recognizing signs of suffocation in elderly victims, as many of Yvan's murders had been classified as natural deaths, despite evidence that should have raised suspicions. Improved forensic techniques and standardized investigation protocols might have led to his earlier detection. Perhaps most importantly, the case showed the value of taking seriously reports from family members who suspect that their relatives' deaths were not natural. The 2 ignored denunciations of Yvan allowed him to continue killing for years, demonstrating the deadly consequences of dismissing such concerns. Today, nearly 2 decades after Yvan Keller's death, his crimes continue to haunt the communities he terrorized and the families of his victims. The peaceful villages of Alsace have never fully recovered the sense of security that allowed elderly residents to trust the strangers who came to their doors offering help and services. The story of Yvan Keller is more than just a tale of greed and murder. It's a chilling reminder of how predators exploit our most basic human needs for help and companionship. His victims were elderly people who had lived through wars, raised families, and contributed to their communities for decades. They deserve to live out their final years in peace and dignity, not to become prey for someone who saw them only as sources of money. Yvan's final words, "I just wanted to be loved," reveal the twisted psychology of someone who confused control with affection, dominance with intimacy. His victims offered him their trust, and he repaid that trust with violence and theft. They welcomed him into their homes as a helpful neighbor, and he turned their sanctuary into their tomb. True crime isn't just about the monsters who walk among us. It's about the systems that allow them to flourish and the societies that must learn to protect their most vulnerable members. We tell these stories not to sensationalize evil, but to honor the memory of those whose final moments were stolen by someone who claimed to love them. The 23 confirmed victims of the pillow killer were mothers, fathers, grandparents, and community elders whose lives had value far beyond the valuables Yvan stole from their homes. They were people who had earned the right to feel safe in their own beds, to trust those who offered to help them, and to die naturally when their time came. Yvan Keller stole all of that from them and from the families who loved them. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think about the trust we place in those who enter our homes, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Weird World Wonders. Every click helps us honor the forgotten victims of history's darkest chapters and ensures their stories continue to be told with the dignity they deserve. Because in the end, the greatest tragedy isn't just that evil exists. It's that it so often wears a friendly face and speaks in gentle words. The victims of the pillow killer trusted Yvan Keller because he seemed like someone who cared about them. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their lives, but our commitment to protecting those who still live in trust and vulnerability.